All right, this is the Gateway API meeting for August 30, 2021. We've got a lot going on, but I think we actually have a lighter agenda than normal, which is great. The big news, obviously, is that RC1 was released. So that's our first release candidate for V1 Alpha 2 of the API. I expect most of you already saw this, but in case anyone missed it, this is a great opportunity. If you're working on implementation or thinking of working on one, this is a great base for that. Although, it's still possible that breaking API changes could happen. I would say that it's unlikely that they will be significant, and this represents something that is quite similar or close to what the final V1 Alpha 2 API will look like. So for anyone working on implementations, good starting point. And big thanks to Nick for actually making this release. Great to have yet another person releasing a version of this API. Yeah, the next thing, another little bit of news, not really much worth discussing too detailed, but we had a lot of discussion around kind and resource as API machinery, SIG architecture, everyone else. Started a conversation again last week, and that started on the mailing list, which I linked in this issue, and eventually went to SIG architecture's meeting last week, and we devoted, I think, most of the meeting to that topic. Got great feedback all around, and although this is not approved, I believe the concepts discussed in this change to API conventions were largely acceptable to everyone on that call. So I'm expecting this to get in as it is. Essentially, this adds guidance that if you have a known set of resources that you are going to target, and there's no room for ambiguity of what a kind should map to, then it's acceptable to use kind instead of resource in your object reference. And I think we can make that argument for Gateway API. So that's really the gist of where this came from. Obviously there's some more recent feedback. I need to tweak some things, but I think this is going to make it in, hopefully. The concept at least seems to be supported. So that all translates to us likely not needing to make any changes in Gateway API for this, which is really what we wanted. So I'm happy about that. Before I move on, did anyone have any questions about this topic, discussion, whatever?
Maybe I'm rat holing, but we don't even know what, like, we have like arbitrary object references, right?
Yeah.
So how can we ensure that kind will computationally point to a single resource type, right, for a specific implementation maybe?
Yeah, that's a good question. At least historically, though, I guess we have no complete guarantee of this. Historically, I have thought of implementations, at least of the Ingress API, and I've thought of implementations of this Gateway API of things where although the API as a core may not understand everything that the extension refs refer out to, every implementation of the API should have a core set of known resources that it supports. So as long as each implementation has no trouble mapping from a kind to a resource, I think we're fine. And that seems like a pretty reasonable expectation that any implementation of this API is going to be able to map from a kind to a resource of the kinds it supports. Does that add up to you?
So I think that makes total sense. What I think we should do is we should have an implementation guideline. Just add like a small documentation update where we make like we say that as an implementer you're responsible that you don't have like a kind that can potentially represent multiple resources, just so that in future we are not bitten by the same problem, or some implementation is not bitten by the same problem, right? It's more of just a we told you to do so, please do so, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
a good idea.
Sorry to be late, guys. I think yeah, we need to just have a guideline of like, don't do this. It will screw you over.
Yeah.
Yeah, like don't do what the scale resource does.
Yes, that is the canonical example of this gone wrong, I guess you could say. Or yeah. So
Yeah, don't
cool.
allow your CIDs to be mounted in more than one place on the API server.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, I think that's the best outcome here is to continue using kind for better usability, familiarity, etc. But if someone has a strong preference to use resource, we can consider that. I personally prefer using something that's more familiar based on, upstream references everywhere.
Yeah,
This is really positive to hear, because we as the one of the leading like out of tray implementations can guide some of this is good news, right? Like we have a lot more feedback and a lot more changes to make. So
Yeah.
this is positive.
definitely a hard agree from me. But yeah, I think the UX things like make me a huge plus in favor of kind over resource.
Agreed. Great. Yeah, I'll leave it there then. Or sorry, Bowie, go ahead.
Are we closing this? I missed
No. So I think we can't close this until probably two things happen. One, we actually need the API convention to be updated. So this needs to merge. And second, I think Harry suggested, it would be good to document our expectation that implementations understand the kind to resource mapping and don't have ambiguity among the kinds they support.
I see, but the title, we're not doing rename kind to resource.
Correct.
Okay, I was a little confused.
Yeah.
So
I
this
can,
particular issue probably should be closed and the follow-ups filed, or we just reword this thing. Right now, it just sounds like we're going to do it, but we're not.
I feel like we can just reword it as decision rename kind of resource, and we put a thing down there saying we have decided not to do this, and here's the remaining.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just clarifying, because looking at it, it sounds like we are going to. It looks like we are.
Yeah.
Do it.
Yep. I think that's fair that we need to make sure it's clarified that we're not going to do it.
Cool. I guess Harry, it looks like this is yours. Do you mind updating the title here?
Yeah, let me take care.
Great. Thanks. Okay, next one. I'm just curious. I know there's a few implementations working on V1 Alpha 2 implementation. I am curious if anyone has a rough goal or timeline for when they think they might have a V1 Alpha 2 implementation ready. No pressure. It does not need to be very specific, but just curious how that progress is going.
Contour, where we got a release scheduled in like 2-3 weeks. I don't know if we'll make it in time. It's pretty substantial coding changes. If not, the one after that will be like 4 or 5 weeks, so probably kind of end of October. So we should definitely be done in the one at the end of October. Possibly earlier. Just depends on how hard the changes are actually to make in our implementation. I'd much rather have it out before KubeCon so that we can have a thing, but it's just we've only got a couple of weeks, and I don't know if we'll be able to pull it together in time.
Yep, makes sense.
Shane, do you have any rough?
Yeah, I was thinking about it. Actually, Rob, just kind of curious, like what you're hoping to gather out of this, just kind of making sure people are actually doing it, or what's up?
No, well, yeah. So I'm obviously curious who's planning on supporting V1 Alpha 2, but I'm also curious just as far as our timeline, like thinking about upcoming releases, about beta, about other updates along the path here. just trying to get a feel for, or even if we want to, we've talked about a blog post at some point about V1 Alpha 2. It would be nice to have some implementations that we can show are already, usable with an API. So I don't know if there's any one goal. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So we're active on this right now, but we're in the early stages. The general hope is just to have it by KubeCon.
Okay.
Yeah, I think like this becomes very critical when we want to demonstrate beta, because beta means we should show some level of interoperability. We shouldn't go beta, or at least we should with just like one implementation.
Yeah.
Agreed. I actually think we probably need to write down, I don't think we've actually written down anywhere that like portability is an explicit goal and define what that means. So we probably need to do a little bit of work there to do that as part of the beta, part of the graduation criteria. In my mind, beta graduation means that there's like portability stuff, but we can talk about that later.
This is actually, yeah, I agree. We should talk about this, and I actually have it a little bit further down on the agenda. So good segue there. Yeah, I completely agree. Anyone else? Jeff, I noticed that you were about to say something, like maybe.
Yeah, we're probably looking at mid-November.
Okay. And that's console or?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. And Bowie, I don't know if we have a timeline. I know we've said Q4.
Yeah, I think that we are shooting for that. So early Q4. So V1 Alpha 2 will likely arrive before that.
Yeah, I sure would hope so.
What I'm saying is for GKE, that's sort of, we're trying to get it out.
Right.
As soon as the release is cut,
yeah,
we would be seeing how to cut over to it.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. I feel like I don't think that the implementation availability should impact cutting RCs or cutting the final version of the spec. The RCs are just to make it easier to get started on the spec, I think, and we can cut the final version without being ready to fully announce that, because nobody's got it implemented yet, I think.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable, because it's impossible to simultaneously revert a release and have cut the version.
Yeah, so I agree with everything there, and it looks like we're going to have a decent chunk of implementations ready by KubeCon. That seems to be a common goal here. So maybe we can have something like more public around that time frame. Cool, great to see progress here. And I also
Susan's just called out she'll implement in the Apache app API 6 project, Ingress project, probably in Q4.
Oh, cool. Okay. Yeah, let me add that from chat. Yeah, thanks.
We don't track others, but I think something that might be useful, and I probably don't think we have the folks on the call, but things like Knative, Cert Manager, they also integrate in a lot of it.
Yeah.
So they don't directly, I don't know, they somehow integrate with us, right? Like they're not direct implementers.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know, actually on that note, I should check in with Ingress Nginx as well, because I know they've been working on this too. So be interesting to see what their timeline is. But yeah, cool to see progress here. Cool. All right, so the next thing, which I think is kind of a natural follow-up to that, is what we need for RC2. So obviously we released RC1 last week. Thank you, everyone. Great to get that one out. I think this is really a rough summary of what we need to get in or want to get in for RC2, but anyone feel free to add to this. I think some of these are more or less, I don't know. I think we'll have more discussion around the port thing than anything else. The rest do not feel too I don't know. I feel like these are all pretty straightforward beyond that. So Susan, I think it looks like you've updated this. I noticed the tests are all passing on this. Any particular status update here, or do you need just another round of review from us?
Yeah, I think, I mean, this change basically is combine, I mean, the comments from the previous A10 here, and some, common sense changes under the validation test cases. It's pretty straightforward, kindly review, and let's push this in.
Okay. Great, thank you. Thanks for taking this on. This is going to help a lot with 780. I think this takes out a chunk of the comments and feedback there. So thanks for getting this one in. I'll take another look after this meeting. Cool.
Thanks.
And the other one that's in flight here is just a whole bunch of little small API changes for the most part. Mostly around Go docs specifically. There are a couple renames in here. One was suggested by Cal. This was controller to controller name. I think that's slightly clearer. It does match what we've seen in upstream, where we've started to add name as a suffix to fields like this. It does unfortunately conflict with Ingress class, where we just have a controller field, not a controller name field. But as Cal says, this is a good opportunity to make something better instead of being stuck with what we had before. I don't have a strong feeling either way, but I'm fine with controller name. The other notable change here is admitted condition has been renamed to accepted. And defaults to unknown instead of false. So yeah, that's what we have going on there. There's obviously a lot more in here that I don't think we have enough time to cover. I know I have some comments in here a lot of comments, thank you, that I need to follow up on. So yeah, if anyone has extra cycles to review, I will be working on this later today. But I think this combined with Susan's PR gets us probably 90% of the way through feedback on Gateway API, SIG network review. So we're getting awfully close here. I know Tim still had some work to do as far as additional types to review. And Andrew, it sounds like he doesn't want us to block without his feedback, but if we're still open to feedback in another week or so, he'll have more time to review. So we'll see when that time gets here. Yeah, so that's an update on V1 Alpha 2 feedback. Again, feel free to run through that PR and make sure that we haven't missed anything, but I think we're getting close. Now, the big one that's in that PR that we have not covered is this recommendation to move from a single port field, a port int, to a struct. And even though that struct would just have a single int inside of it, the rationale is that it could expand and allow for things like all ports in the future, or port ranges, or other things that might be a little bit more flexible than a single int allows. The obvious reference here is to the all ports cap, which I have linked weirdly. And this is still very much in progress and has lots of feedback. But I think the key reason to link to it is it's something that the community seems to want and have interest in. And it's more difficult in upstream right now just because we have that single int, we have those strict requirements. I know there's been some discussion around that, and we had some discussion last week around this concept. Some concerns specific to all ports, that it could be difficult or impossible for some implementations to support. I wanted to open that back up again and get just kind of a feeling of how we feel about first making port a struct instead of an int, And second, related to that, how we feel about the possibility of adding support for something like all ports in the future. Certainly not part of this release.
Hey, Rob, James. Is this really a widely desired feature? Because I read the thing, I read the information they'd gathered, and it really seemed like there was a few pretty niche sorts of applications where this would be useful. It didn't seem like, oh, it's really going to be in common usage. So I wonder how much of this would be, okay, we're going to inflict a bunch more YAML on everyone, just so a very small number of applications can be supported in a very small number of controllers.
I feel like that's a fair point, James. But in my mind, the one that I'm worried about here is that this is the one shot we have to do this. If we do have to walk this back and change something later, it's going to be really hard. If something comes like
walk back in which direction?
The cost is one layer of indentation in YAML, which does kind of suck, agreed. But the cost of not doing it is that later on we will need to do like a major version rev to change this. Like I feel like in the cost trade-off department, the risk that somebody is like that later on people might be like, yeah, I want to do IP forwarding or some other thing that's like I don't care about ports, is non-zero. And then if we don't do this now, then if we do want to handle those use cases later, it will need a major API version rev because we don't want to do this now.
Yeah, I think that's basically where the discussion was pushing, is that we know there's these use cases out there, and if we could set it up so that it's not very awkward later, then maybe this is worth a trade-off.
Yeah, and I think it's worth clarifying that it's not necessarily just all ports. All ports is a proposal that we know is very real and something we can link to, but just even port ranges or other things that are currently impossible in upstream that could be useful potentially here. I recognize that anytime we have to add more YAML indentation, it's not a great user experience. So probably part of this is we should walk through exactly what conversion logic would look like with and without a struct. Like if we have an int now, do we have a path forward that is not terrible for conversion, or are we just kind of stuck with it? But I'm certainly interested in not locking ourselves too much in this one direction, given that we're already seeing the limits of that in upstream, and it would be a shame to do the same thing all over again. Yeah.
I guess, James, I feel like there's a little bit of a question on the table here for you. Like, given that trade-off, like how do you feel about it?
I honestly don't feel super strongly. If you say, if we turn ports into a struct and you have ports number, that doesn't feel like a different sort of problem to extend that than if you say, oh, well, in the future we have a ports int and we have a sibling structure, which is a port value or port spec struct. Like it doesn't really seem substantially different.
Yeah, and I think you're probably onto something there, and it's worth digging into that a bit more. I'm curious if part of the reason it's challenging is because service is a V1 API, so you can't even you really can't change anything with that, whereas we have a bit more flexibility until we reach GA. So I am curious what the different conversion stories would look like, and it may not be as bad as it seems. One other, just to throw everything out there, one other suggestion from Tim, I don't even know if it was a suggestion as much as a question, but one of his comments in the SIG network review was have we considered making port optional? Which feels related to this discussion. If we had an optional port, then you have a little bit of flexibility what a default means, like the controller sets what port is assigned. The controller assigns a port to a listener.
I think that one feels like if we don't do the struct, we should do the optional thing, because if we make it non-optional, it's not clear we can extend it at all later.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Because
think I think what Harry said in chat is true, that there is precedence for making a required field optional and not considering it a breaking change. You need a new, you need a new version, but I think you can make that transition all right. But it is easier if you're starting from an optional state, or potentially easier. It gets a little weird, like if it's optional for TCP or UDP, what is it? Just kind of implementation auto assigns you a port and that's fine? Maybe that's okay. I don't know.
I mean, that's optimizing for future use cases that we don't understand today. So, I mean, I err on the side of, let's optimize for today. And if we have a path forward in future, let's just punt it. Because you can make that change. If it was like a breaking change, then doing it has some precedence, but otherwise, I don't see a precedence for doing this today.
Wait, Harry, do you have a reference to that? Making a required field optional is not a breaking change?
Yeah.
Sometimes these things are a little subtle.
Yeah, I mean, so if you have a field that is optional and you make that required, you might have any spec that you define, or you could potentially break a user, right? But let's say you have a field that is required today and tomorrow it's optional. The thing that the user was using previously, we wouldn't break them, right?
There's some nuance there, and I need to dig into that. I think you're largely correct, but it's still there's some safety mechanisms in upstream Kubernetes that help us there. So as I understand how we do that in upstream, like how we transition a field from required to optional, is we have to do it over 2 or 3 different release cycles. And the idea is that you have to document it well, and you have to be able to round trip between the 2 versions, kind of thing. And so you need to start loosening that validation before you truly make the field optional. I'm not sure what the parallel is for CRDs. So like what you're saying is true for upstream APIs. I don't know how we make that same thing work with this world. This is all new to me.
It's all new to everyone. So I think
yeah,
we're gonna end up defining how this works, right? Like, so because we're the first ones to do it. I think that I feel like, to me, that making a required field making a required field optional does feel like a change that could go pretty badly wrong, because the risk that you're running there is like what happens if it's not supplied behavior, the null behavior. I think, as James said in the chat, like it makes sense for HTTP and HTTPS, I guess, because it's like, if you don't, or in the case that it's like the behavior is that if you don't supply a port, then the controller will assign you one. That is kind of nice. That kind of hits to what one of the other things that Tim was saying is like, why should I need to configure it if I don't care? But like if the port is optional, it kind of also makes distinguishing between listeners a little harder, because that's one of the primary keys at the moment that we use to distinguish between listeners. And like if a listener is distinct from another listener.
So
yeah, it's true. Additional name is
yeah.
required, so that helps. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. I feel like it feels to me like the options are like we move to a struct because then you can do this stuff inside the struct a little bit easier than you can if it fields one level higher. But it's not, again, James's point is fair that it's not that much easier. You still got to change things from required to optional and stuff like that inside the struct. So the sort of, I think the key thing is like the cases that people are asking for, I've definitely asked for upstream stuff, are the all ports one and the and port ranges. It does suck to have to make like 20 different port entries for if you've got 20 different ports on a listener, or if you're doing some like TCP protocol that requires you to expose like 100 ports. That's going to make your YAML extremely unwieldy, and having a way to do that would be like having a spot to be able to put that later would be nice. And like, I mean, that is absolutely a thing that people will want for the layer 4 stuff. And I think, yeah, so I think it feels to me like, those are the two use cases that we should consider here, because like, I don't know if anyone else has used firewalls, but having firewalls that can't do that stuff really sucks.
The more I'm thinking about this, the more I don't know. I mean, it even just the idea of an optional port does not sound as bad. If you look at the PR and my initial response to Tim, I was saying, oh, we probably shouldn't do that, essentially. And now I'm beginning to be won over by that being not a bad idea. It leaves a lot more room for flexibility, and it's something that in a lot of cases, for HTTP HTTPS, we can generally determine the protocol, the port that someone is going to want based on the protocol. And for others, we could auto assign worst case, which does not seem that bad either. Especially now that we're requiring listener name, I tend to agree with what others have said so far. I don't know.
Yeah, I think having a port
it is true that it needs to be optional, period, right, Rob? Even if we moved it into a struct, it's actually two things.
Well,
because if you move it into struct, it's still required, then that doesn't really address the other issues.
Right. So if you want port to be extensible, it needs to become optional at some point in the future. That's it. I mean, if the whole idea is that we want to support all ports or port ranges or some other extension mechanism, we need a way to make port the single int optional at some point, even if it doesn't start that way. And I think this goes to what James said. It's kind of like, it doesn't matter as much whether or not it's in a struct. It seems like we just need a path for it to become optional and to become extended.
I think your point is fair, Rob. It's like there's actually not that many downsides to having it be optional right away.
Okay, well, let me work on.
Wait, if it's optional, does that? Are you saying, when you say is it optional, would the result of that be any different than for HTTP we default to port 80, for HTTPS we default to 443? Is that?
I think that's a very reasonable assumption to make. I don't know how prescriptive we need to be about what controllers choose to assign as ports for a given protocol.
I think we should be 100% prescriptive. I think if there's one thing I have learned is that we must be 100% prescriptive. We don't want to leave any room for implementations to be different. So it should be, it's optional. If the protocol is HTTP or HTTPS or TLS and the port is not supplied, then it will default to these. If it is TCP route for layer 4 protocols, if the port is not supplied, the implementation must auto assign a port and make it available in the status. Done.
I'd agree with Nick there. I think if it's optional, we do need to specify what the behavior is. when it's not specified.
Yeah, that seems fair. I'm trying to think of some edge cases here, like a finite set of ports available, something like that. But really, that seems like a reasonable set of default guidance.
If a port, and then if a port cannot be assigned automatically, then that's the same as if you asked for a port and it could not be assigned. Because there's a finite set of ports and you're out of ports, then it's the same as if you asked for a specific port and you couldn't get that specific port because there's something else already had it.
This feels like I'm going too far down a rabbit hole that probably doesn't exist, but let's just pretend that 80 is already accounted for, it's already used, and somebody specifies a new listener on their gateway with an HTTP protocol. Should the implementation just try and assign a different port, or if for some reason, in that
case, I think probably we should go with the simplest thing, which is that the defaulting is like a syntactic thing almost, as opposed to trying to be clever. But
in that specific case, though, for HTTP, HTTPS, and TLS, there are additional routing discriminators aside from port that we can use. So in those cases, it's the behavior that I would expect as a consumer of the API is that if you specify multiple HTTP listeners, whether or not they specify ports, if they all end up on the same port, then they all get multiplexed using the host header, like using the host details. That's as the same as you would if you had multiple HTTP listeners specifying the same port. It's like and as Bowie says, that's like a syntactic sugar for if you don't specify something and it's HTTP, then we're going to give you 80.
Yeah, at least that boils down to the same case we already had previously versus trying to add some new nuance to it.
Okay, yeah, I think that makes sense. I'll need to think through some edge cases a bit more. Like I think there's some in-cluster proxies that at least in some cases prefer not to be deployed with access to privileged ports or things like that. Like I feel like there's some weird edge cases around this.
I think in that case, the user would, if they asked for 80, they would get rejected, right? So it's kind of in the same scenario. They would just have to explicitly say, hey, I want this non-privileged port.
So
I guess my argument there is why would they need to specify that instead? Like this by default, this in-cluster implementation that has low privileges is going to do 80/80 or something like that.
Oh, I see. So instead we change the spec to say, well, the implementation is going to assign you a port, period. And then we don't say
right. That's my concern about being too prescriptive here, is that there may be some edge case in the future that we're not predicting right now, like low privilege ports or something like that we don't want to box anyone too far into a corner.
Yeah, I think that Harry just mentioned in chat that we should time box this. I do think that there's a slightly orthogonal discussion there that is relevant about what the port actually is. Like it's the outside port, right? Like the port that stuff that is destined for the gateway needs to consider. So like in cluster proxy should really be saying that port as the port that the stuff that's not in the cluster is the port the port is the port that stuff that is not in the cluster cares about. Whether or not that's an internet or some other external to the cluster thing or something like that, then I think that's the key.
You're right. That is a good distinction. So they could have a service type LB or something point. Yeah. Okay. Let me, I can.
Definitely needs an issue.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone want to volunteer to create an issue or follow up with this one?
I can take an action. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks. All right. Next one is removing extension ref. I've covered a little. I referenced that as an item down here as well. Harry, your gap is already merged. I just had one question. I think you've already responded to and whatever, but I wanted to bring it to a broader audience here as well about extension ref and when we remove it from routes, what that looks like. But in this context, all I want to say is this is something that is in scope for RC2 in my mind. Anyone dispute that? Like, I think this feels like it belongs. Okay, next one, and we'll come back to that momentarily. Actually, no, let me move on to that one quickly because the next one's going to be a discussion too. So Harry, I think you've updated this PR already. At first, what you had here is you left matches alone in, so TCP, UDP, and TLS routes all had a matches concept, but the only match was an extension ref. And we determined that we didn't really have a good use case for an extension ref match. But that meant that by removing this, we don't have anything to match on for TCP, UDP, or TLS as host name, but we don't have a matches struct anywhere. Does it feel appropriate to remove the entire match? This is, to clarify, this is something that I think I'd suggested, but I didn't want to be the only one suggesting this. So wanted to get some more visibility on this. Does this change feel appropriate on these L4 route types?
Is it just empty?
It is, the option is it's either empty, we just have a matches struct that has nothing in it, or we don't have a matches struct at all. And then the only thing that's in TCP route is a list of backend refs, which is what's currently proposed.
It sounds okay. The only concern is if we resurrect it, does this present a problem? Probably not, because we're just adding a field.
Yeah, like I know there's like, we have open issues already for destination address and port matching. And I know that's something like we want to get in. So I know this is probably going to return, but in its absence, I think it's less confusing to just not have it than to have an empty struct where you can't specify anything. So I think this is fine, but.
That's a big agreement from me.
Cool.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to think if there's any example where we kind of left something empty. I don't remember, I can't recall any.
Yeah, there aren't any downsides to either way, right? Like it's mostly like how much overhead the user has. I mean, that's how I see it. So
Yeah,
I
have. Go
Sorry,
ahead.
I was gonna say, I think the thing I like about this is that it makes the story clear for sort of our initial launch to the world that TCP route right now, it's a one-to-one thing. Yeah, you get a list, the port on the listener goes to a single backend service, end of story. And then later on we can make that more complicated, but it makes the story simple to tell to start with.
Yeah.
And I think we need to be really careful about that because this API is complicated enough already. It's hard to explain. Like adding more things that are sort of hard to explain without, especially if we don't have a way to actually give you an example of what it does, is really bad.
Agreed. Cool. Okay. Well, yeah, I'm glad that we're in agreement there. If anyone has any last concerns, raise them soon on here. Otherwise, I think we can just get this one in, and that will be one last thing between us and RC2. All right. So covered this one. The last two items I had on this list, one was custom match types for HTTP route. I feel like that could take a little bit of discussion. So let me run through what's currently proposed as V1 Beta 1 graduation criteria. I think this is likely, beta graduation criteria. I think this is likely less controversial. I just wanted to raise it as something. And this is something, this is the cap that we needed to create. It's mostly a formality for becoming part of the K8s.io API group. And one of the things that with every KEP is you need this concept of graduation criteria for each stage. And obviously one of our goals is to get to beta. And since that's our next stage, needed some graduation criteria here. I have a list here that feels pretty non-controversial, but I wanted to highlight it and make sure that people were aware of what I'm proposing here, and that nothing was too, that I didn't miss anything, or that I didn't have anything in here that was too over the top. So I don't think there's much to say here other than just this exists. If you have suggestions for how to improve or change it, just let me know or add a comment here. All right, I'll keep on moving then.
There's something I was saying
Go
something
ahead.
earlier, but I can't remember what it was, Rob. Something about something we needed to do for beta.
So I know one of them, you were talking specifically about being implemented by several implementations.
Portability.
Okay. Portability. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what it was. Yeah. That there's some contract that we've all agreed on that about what portability means, and that we've agreed on what portability means, and that implementation, that there is portability between implementations.
Yeah,
something.
Probably that's like we could just add that to that initial conformance test. So it seems like it's in that line.
That probably makes sense.
That's a good point. Yeah.
But I feel like one of the primary value, like one of the biggest end user value that they're going to get out of this API is portability for something between implementations. Probably routes between gateways, I think, off the top of my head, but portability is like a big win for the end user. So I think we need to enshrine it somewhere as both a goal of the project and ensure that we have tests to check that that's the case.
Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. All right, I think that's it. Just a reminder, this KEP exists. It's such a formality. I don't think it's really blocking anything, so it doesn't need a ton of attention. But if anyone has some extra cycles to take a look, I think it's relatively close. Other than I should update this a little bit.
One question:
does this go into the case? Does this go into the case release cycle, Rob? Like, are we specifically targeting it or something, or is it just kind of
no, kind of? It's kind of hanging out there. One thing this allows us to do a little bit easier is it allows us to get docs in, because we now are owners of a KEP, and docs often are tied to KEPs. So for that's helpful. But no, this is not tied to Kubernetes release cycle per se, other than that we can track enhancements from alpha to beta to GA, but I think that's it. Again, we're kind of blazing our own trail here, and I was talking with John from SIGARCH about this, and it sounds like the KEP isn't completely necessary, but it's just helpful for process, and so just going through it. Yeah,
I had the same question.
Cool. All right, so the last one that I want to discuss today is this thing. As part of removing extension ref matching, we really realized that, this extension ref matching probably doesn't make a lot of sense, or we didn't have clear use cases for it. But there are, we got some feedback, I think, from Dan in the SIG network review that, and I think elsewhere as well, that implementation specific matching is weird as we have it right now. So basically his concept is, if you have more match types than exact prefix or regex, then you kind of have to munge them all together into implementation specific. So you could have some kind of prefix in your value that says this is another kind of string match type that we don't support in our core API. I know one that has gotten some interest is like templatized matching as an idea. These are things that could technically get, thrown into an implementation specific match, but I'm not sure that's the best way to represent those or extend match types. So this proposal that originated from Slack or GitHub comment, I forget exactly, is really just suggesting that we keep these core or extended match types, but then allow for free-form qualified name match types that are vendor specific. This would be a different way to extend the API, essentially. I think, Harry, you had some comments just this afternoon. I don't know if you want to add in like what you're thinking about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think if implementation specific doesn't, and I don't note this in the issue, is like if it doesn't make sense, we could start with a narrower API and then we revisit this. But the more types that we add, I think we are just we are asking a bit too much from the user. Remember that this is how users do matching of traffic to forward requests, right? That's the core use case, right? And this is a little sensitive area because mistakes can be easily made if you play around with types or you have typos. And in my experience, those mistakes are far easier to make than we assume, and the consequences of those mistakes are often hard to foresee, or maybe they're larger usually than you foresee. So having having simpler number matching criterias are usually more maintainable, even for complicated use cases, rather than going for something like regex, which is something I personally always advise users to not use, although there are some use cases for that. So something like parameterized matches, yes, that is there is some use for it with, I think, filters in my experience, but I mean using matching for that it can be very tricky. So, and I think today we don't have very concrete use cases. So rather than complicating this, making this more extensible, it would be better to keep this simple for now and then come to it later. And somebody should have a very good argument of adding this in. That's my view on this topic. So I'm happy. I'd like to hear out more thoughts on this.
I think from my perspective, we should figure out if we should delete implementation specific. So implementation specific was almost a solution to a problem we created for ourselves in Ingress, and we just had no way out. So we just had to say the string that exists there is implementation specific because we can't really speak to it in any detail, and they had to be a default value that these kinds of fields like match ended up taking, because we had to convert from something that said nothing to something that said something. Kind of, yes, you're right in that we can stick with this prefix exact regex. I'm fairly certain we can also just find examples of where specific implementations want to support even more clever matches. The question in my mind is like, do we delete implementation specific, and we don't need to necessarily add this qualified name thing right now, but that would be better than saying having implementation specific, knowing that that was a kludge that was mostly there for Ingress transition issues.
I'm supportive of removing implementation specific right now. I just had a thought as well that we really need to clarify like what regex actually means, because it's like which one.
We can refer that was a discussion. We can refer to that conversation.
Yeah, that's documented well, I think. I hope.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I hadn't checked, but I think removing implementation specific at this point is fine. And then if we want to add in extra things later, that's additive, not not subtractive, so it's no problem. I think it's better to remove implementation specific now and say there are 3 match methods and only 3 match methods. If you want to add more, that's fine. Come and talk to us.
Okay, that definitely is simpler, and I agree with Bowie's point here. Like that implementation specific is an unfortunate holdover from Ingress, where we were, stuck trying to provide some kind of backwards compatibility, and implementation specific was basically just backwards compatible to whatever it was before. This is probably not a good thing to carry on to Gateway API, so I'm happy to remove it. I am a little bit sad to remove it without a replacement, because I do think there probably are some extension mechanisms lurking here. And if in the same release we've removed implementation specific matching and extension ref, we've really limited how you can extend matching for a route or anything like that. So I'm a bit hesitant on that. But I am supportive of removing implementation specific at least. And I need to think a little bit more about if we need to provide an alternative or not.
I think
I think
it seems like this is a reasonable alternative. So maybe in part of removing it, everyone will show up, and then we can have the actual conversation.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Like, I feel like the best thing to do is, hey, do we really need this extra sensibility? The way to do it is to take it out and then wait and see if anyone asks. And if anyone asks, then we put it back in. But like, then we're starting out from a simple place, and then not needing to make breaking changes because we tried to anticipate stuff that we didn't anticipate. Like, we can make additive changes. That's fine, but if we lock in something now, like, that's kind of it. Like, it's hard to fix it later.
Is it, I don't know how API machinery deals with this, but is it possible to have a raw message in a field that's deep in a CRD?
What do you mean by that?
I think the way I'll try and put together a PR with what I mean. I'm wondering whether we can, instead of having implementation specific, we can have an implementation specific field, which is just an opaque JSON blob.
Oh, you can do that. We've shied away from that. That is an available type.
That feels
People
like
had not had a good experience with it.
But that's kind of what you want for this case, because like, if you want to be able to have enough field, you don't know what fields you need because you don't know what the match type is, and you don't really want to have a separate CRD because then you're making it a lot harder for users. So I feel like that's probably the sweet spot.
I think it's
serious, Harry.
It's kind of acceptable to some extent, but it does reinvent the annotations problem and then impact the portability again. The reason to make all of this stuff declared as fields rather than having as JSON blobs or map string or something like that is that then there's no way in which an implementation can differ, but like, this stuff can differ between implementations.
Yeah, but this is by definition implementation specific.
Sure, but like,
I think the issue that if we went that way, we would need to solve is to just make sure that you are able to find your own ones. The reason why qualified name is good in some ways is because it comes with the name of the implementation kind of stuck as the key. Like, if it's just arbitrary JSON blob, we probably have to put something around it as well.
Yeah, so the match type would be a domain qualified string that you match, and that defines the expected schema of the JSON blob.
I think so we're over time, but I think it's worth discussing more. I think the thing that we know, it seems like we have pretty clear consensus that implementation specific as it exists right now does not make sense. And also that not necessarily now, but potentially at a later point, we're open to replacing that with some other implementation specific extension mechanism as we get use cases for it. But that's the general consensus I'm getting right now. Does that add up with what others are hearing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm in
Great.
favor of removing what we have now.
Okay, cool. Yeah, let's work with that. If anyone wants to volunteer just to sign themselves to this issue, otherwise we can, you know, otherwise I can take it on a bit later, but happy if someone else wants to.
This doesn't need a gap, right?
I feel like not, we're just removing an enum from validation. I think that's all. I think that's I don't know, and someone can feel free to correct me on this one, but
I think as long as we have a record in an issue somewhere, that's fine. This one doesn't really get.
Okay, I'll take it.
cool. Awesome. Thanks. All right. Well, that's all we had for today. Thanks everyone for the great discussion, and we'll talk to you next week.